Hello, this is Whitney, your academic writing specialist, and today we're going to cover 5 myths and misconceptions about grammar. These are pieces of misinformation that are pervasive and that people believe are hard and fast grammatical rules, and we're going to do a little debunking. Now, before we start, I believe in a very basic tenet about grammar and writing, and that is that I believe that the grammatical rule should serve the writing and not the other way around. So if you have a rule that is archaic, that maybe was invented many hundreds of years ago, but doesn't really apply nowadays, it's not the way people speak now, it requires you to do verbal gymnastics in order to be able to stick to it, then that is an instance where the writing is serving the rule and the rule is not serving the writing. You should always strive for clarity, simplicity, and that is what I believe you should prioritize rather than sticking firmly to every single grammatical rule that you learned in elementary school. And some of these myths, you're going to see that at play. So let's get started. Myth number 1 is that it is always correct to say you and I, or Mark and I, Sally and I, and that it is never correct to say you and me, Mark and me, Sally and me, etc. Not true. In fact, it depends on the sentence, and there's a real easy way to tell whether you and I is correct or you and me is correct, and that is take the other guy out of the sentence. Just take him out of the equation and say the sentence as you would say it if that other person were not involved. So for example, if I were to say, oh, there's a beautiful picture of Paul and blank in our living room. There's a beautiful picture of Paul and blank in our living room. Now, let's take Paul out of that sentence and decide which is correct. Would I say there's a beautiful picture of I in our living room? Or would I say there's a beautiful picture of me in our living room? And we all know there's a beautiful picture of me. So in that instance, me is appropriate, not I. There's a beautiful picture of Paul and me in our living room. There you go. It's as easy as that. Take the other person out. If I is correct, then I is correct with the other person there too. If me is correct, then me is correct with the other person there as well. Easy peasy. So that one's debunked. Let's move on to myth number 2. Always capitalize job titles. Well, in fact, you only capitalize job titles in a couple of very specific instances. You capitalize a job title if it immediately precedes or follows the person's name, because in that instance, it is really part of their name. So if I were to say, I'm going to invite Dean Johnson to dinner, it's immediately preceding the name. It is in fact part of the name, and therefore it should be capitalized in that instance. I'm going to invite Dean Johnson to dinner. It would also be appropriate to capitalize if I were to say, ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce Jose Johnson, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. In that case, it's immediately following this person's name, and therefore it should also be capitalized. Now, if the job title is interrupted by a word or words between the name and the title, then it's lowercase. So for example, if I were to say, I am going to invite Jose Johnson, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, to dinner. We've got the name, then we've got the word the interrupting, and then we've got the job title. In that case, Dean should be lowercase because we're talking about the Dean. We're not talking about this person's name, Dean blank blank. We're using the word descriptively. A Dean, the Dean, right? So in that instance, it should be lowercase. So that is the first instance in which you should capitalize a job title, if it immediately precedes or follows a person's name with no interruption between the name and the title. The other instance is basically vanity. If you have an employer or coworker who you know prefers for you to capitalize their job title, then go ahead and do it because you don't need to get in trouble at your job because of this. And many people do not know this rule. Many people do it incorrectly, and you're going to see that a lot out in the world. And there is definitely a stipulation for vanity in this, or just for preference if we're going to put it in a nicer way. So if you know that somebody prefers it, go ahead and do it. It's not the end of the world. But it is technically only correct if it precedes or follows the name with no interruption. Okay, myth number 3. Never end a sentence with a preposition. So what is a preposition? Well, when I was in elementary school, they taught us that a preposition is anywhere a mouse can go. So it's words like of, in, over, under, above, things like that. But it also includes words like with and at. And if you go online, you can Google it and find a long, long list of other examples of prepositions. And most of us have been taught to absolutely never end a sentence with one of them. Now, this is a bit of an archaic rule. It is true that it is often grammatically incorrect to end a sentence with a preposition, but it is also true that we have to bend ourselves into verbal pretzels sometimes to avoid it. So, for example, if I were to say, who did you go to the movie with? You know, it's not technically grammatically correct to say that, but how many real people in the real world are going to say, with whom did you go to the movie? We just don't really do that. If you're writing, maybe it's better to say with whom, but in spoken English, in that instance, it's really okay. If you're having to do verbal gymnastics to avoid it, then, you know, oftentimes it's better to just ignore the rule. But there's also sort of a rule of thumb that says that if the sentence would mean the same thing without the preposition, then you should leave it out. So, for example, if I were to say, where are you at? Now, in that instance, where are you means the same thing and says it more concisely. So I would recommend cutting that preposition in that instance and just saying, where are you? Where are you at is unnecessary. So in that instance, I would absolutely agree. Do not end that sentence with a preposition because it's unnecessary. But if you need it to convey your meaning, then go right ahead and leave it in. It's fine to say something like, I'm going out. Out is a preposition, but let's just say I'm going. Well, going where? I'm going out is perfectly fine because in that instance, you need that preposition to convey your meaning. It's fine to say something like, I'm tired. I think I'll sleep in. Also necessary to convey your meaning and perfectly fine. So sometimes it's actually necessary to end a sentence with a preposition to convey the necessary meaning, but also sometimes it's just a matter of I don't want to have to bend myself into a verbal pretzel and I don't want to have to sound like Masterpiece Theater to get this very simple idea across. So can you sometimes end a sentence in a preposition? Absolutely you can. Okay, this next one is a little tricky. Myth number 4 is that passive voice is always wrong. And myth number 5 is that passive voice is always right. So there are sort of advocates on both sides of this debate. And first I'll give you a very brief thumbnail sketch of what passive voice is. So passive voice is a grammatical structure where you put the emphasis on the action rather than the actor. So you're putting the emphasis grammatically and sentence structure-wise on what is being done versus who is doing it. So, for example, passive voice would be to say, the paper was written by me. And when you see that verbal structure, like was written by, was conducted by, that tends to indicate passive voice. You tend to see a lot of be verbs in there and the word by. So that's an example of passive voice. Active voice, on the other hand, puts the emphasis on the actor, on the doer, rather than the deed. So active voice in that sentence would be to say, I wrote the paper, I conducted the study, we conducted the study. So when is it appropriate to use passive voice and when is it appropriate to use active voice? Well, the simple answer is use active voice when you want the emphasis on the doer and use passive voice when you want the emphasis on the deed. So an example of a time when passive voice would be appropriate would be a sentence like, the lights were installed on the sides of the cabinet. Now, in that case, the salient point is where are the lights, right? The salient point is not that Joe Bob installed them because we don't care about that. We just want to know where they are. So in that instance, it's perfectly fine to say the lights were installed on the sides of the cabinet versus Jack Jones installed the lights on the sides of the cabinet. So another instance of a time when passive voice would be preferable would be a sentence like, the king was assassinated. Now, the important thing there is that the king is dead, right? We don't really care that Roy Jones assassinated the king because we don't know who Roy Jones is. We just want to know what happened, and that is that the king was assassinated. So those are just two quick examples of times when passive voice would be appropriate. Now, Oftentimes in scientific writing, people use passive voice to avoid having to use the first person, either singular I or plural we. So this is a thorny issue, and there's sort of a heated debate going on about this still, because for decades and decades, scientific writers have been taught never to use the first person. Don't say I in a scientific paper. Don't say we in a scientific paper. And that was the norm for a long time. That is changing. And if you don't like that, please don't shoot the messenger, because I didn't change it. But if you look at the 6th edition APA Style Handbook, it very specifically states in there to use active voice, to go ahead and use the first person, and to not use passive voice structures, because active voice is more accurate, it is more concise, it's more direct, and that is the trend. Now, there are many, many advocates still for the old way. And you're going to find that if you do adopt the new way, that sometimes people will nail you on it, and they'll say don't use first person. But then you can say, look at the 6th edition APA Style Handbook, or you can blame me and direct them to this video. It is a trend that's changing, and I think the reason why for so long that was forbidden is because when you say it was found that blah, 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 it sort of sounds like the finding is coming from the ether. It sounds like it has an added gravitas. It sounds like we just discovered this truth that's been out there in the world. It does, you know, when you say I discovered or I found, it sort of gives you, well, who are you? You're just a guy. Why should we trust you? And I think that's why that's been the preference for so long, because people feel that to say it was found that instead of we found or I found, that it somehow adds weight. And I think nowadays we're trying to move away from that sort of false sense of gravitas and false sense of weight, and to just acknowledge that, you know, we're researchers, this is what we found, this is our study. You know, it's not necessarily the end-all, be-all. I mean, you know, when you write a research report, you always have to write a limitations section, and so you're not presenting your findings as absolute truth. And I think it's just sort of an acknowledgement of that, and that may explain the change in the trend. So what I will say to you is that personally, I believe that active voice is a-okay in a scientific paper. I think it's fine to say I think it's fine to say we. You should not use we unless it's accurate. So if you wrote the paper by yourself, if you did the research by yourself, don't say we, because that's not accurate. But if you have co-authors, if you have co-investigators, then we is absolutely okay. We conducted the study, I conducted the study, I found, we found is perfectly fine. But be ready, because some people don't like that and may call you on it. All right. So I hope that this has been helpful. Just 5 quick grammar myths and misconceptions. I may actually do a follow-up video on this with some additional ones. And as always, happy scribbling, and feel free to get in touch if you have any questions. Take care. Bye-bye.